He didn't look up when he ended my career, just slid the folder across the glass table as if I were already invisible. I signed without trembling, without arguing, without asking why. What he didn't notice was that my signature wasn't surrender. It was timing. The conference room smelled faintly of roasted coffee and polished oak, the kind of scent companies bottle as success. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a glossy brochure. Clean lines, obedient traffic, sunlight spilling over mirrored towers. Inside, however, the air had weight, the kind that settles on your shoulders when something irreversible is about to happen. He sat at the head of the table, jacket folded with surgical precision over the back of his chair. His cufflinks flashed every time he moved his hand, as if even his accessories demanded attention. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your position is eliminated," he said without looking up. The sentence landed softly, almost politely, a corporate lullaby. Around the table, the executives lowered their eyes in synchronized discretion. No one wanted to witness impact. That's how offices work. Storms are acknowledged only after the windows are replaced. I let the silence stretch, not dramatically, not defiantly, just long enough for it to become uncomfortable. He slid the folder toward me with 2 fingers, careful, detached. Inside were the termination documents, precisely formatted, legally distilled, scrubbed of emotion. A tidy ending to a decade of building departments, stabilizing quarterly chaos, carrying crises on my back while others collected applause. My pulse didn't betray me. That surprised him, I could tell. He finally looked up. There's a certain expression powerful men wear when they expect collapse. Anticipation mixed with boredom. He was ready for pleading, for negotiation, for a flash of wounded pride. What he received instead was a calm smile and the faint scratch of my pen signing my name. I didn't argue. That unsettled him more than tears would have. Outside, sunlight bounced off neighboring buildings like applause from a distant crowd. Inside, the quiet grew sharper. I closed the folder carefully, aligning its edges with the table as though tidiness mattered. "You're taking this, well," he observed. "I believe in structure," I replied, "even when it shifts." A subtle frown. He wasn't sure whether I was agreeing or warning him. 2 seats down, HR adjusted her glasses and avoided eye contact. She had sent me congratulatory emails for years. Incredible turnaround. Impressive leadership. Strategic brilliance. Now her lips were pressed into neutrality. Loyalty in corporate corridors evaporates faster than perfume in summer. Still, something in the room had shifted, so faint most wouldn't notice. But I did, because the folder he slid across the table was not the only folder that existed. 3 weeks earlier, during what he had called a routine restructuring conversation, he had mentioned consolidation of equity. Casual tone, almost careless. He'd spoken about voting shares as though they were chess pieces he alone moved. That was the moment I knew the temperature of the water, and I do not swim blindly. That evening, long after the office lights dimmed, I reviewed every contract I had ever signed, every equity agreement, every clause tucked between polite legal paragraphs. I requested certified copies, not through drama, but through formality. When the corporate secretary asked why, I smiled. "For clarity," I said. Clarity is such an innocent word. It rarely alarms anyone. What the documents revealed was not dramatic at first glance. No fireworks, no scandal, just percentages. Numbers resting quietly beside my name. Shares issued during expansion years. Incentive grants that had converted when targets were exceeded. Early investor dilution that had shifted more than anyone recalculated. The total sat there calmly. 85% voting shares. I remember staring at the number while the city outside my apartment flickered into night. Not disbelief, recognition, because the equity awards had accumulated slowly, almost invisibly. While others celebrated promotions and titles, I negotiated ownership. I asked questions during board votes. I accepted stock in lieu of bonuses when cash flow tightened. They called it loyalty. It was foresight. Back in the conference room, he was explaining severance details, outlining transition timelines. Words like efficiency, streamlining, strategic pivot, each syllable polished to remove blame. I watched him speak. What fascinated me was not the decision itself. It was his certainty, the confidence of someone who believes authority is synonymous with control. He thought eliminating my position eliminated my influence. He had forgotten that companies are not chairs or offices or titles. They are structures built on paper. And paper remembers. When he finished, he extended his hand across the table, a gesture rehearsed in countless power exits. "I wish you the best," he said. I shook his hand. "I'm sure we'll speak again soon," I replied. This time, his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, the faintest crease between his brows, a flicker of something he couldn't categorize. I gathered my bag, stood, and left without looking back. The hallway outside felt colder. Conversations paused as I passed, doors half closed, screens minimized. News travels at the speed of Wi-Fi in corporate ecosystems. By the time I reached the elevator, sympathy had already been drafted. The doors slid shut. Alone at last, I exhaled. Not from defeat, from patience. The mirror inside the elevator reflected a woman composed, almost serene. But beneath that composure, something steady was unfolding, like the slow rotation of a vault lock clicking into place. He believed this was the end of a chapter. He had no idea it was an opening move. And if you think this was just a termination, you're underestimating what 85% voting shares really mean. Some stories don't explode immediately. Some detonate at the board meeting. The morning of the board meeting arrived with theatrical precision. Rain traced slow, deliberate paths down the glass facade of headquarters, blurring the skyline into watercolor streaks of gray and silver. Inside, the building hummed with its usual choreography, elevators whispering, heels striking marble, the low murmur of assistants coordinating agendas like air traffic controllers. No one expected turbulence. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to prove punctuality. Punctuality is currency for those seeking approval. I no longer needed approval. I needed alignment. In my leather portfolio rested certified copies of share allocations, amended equity agreements, notarized confirmations. Paper doesn't tremble. It simply waits. The receptionist blinked when she saw me. "I thought," she began. "I have a seat at the table," I replied gently. Technically true, just not in the way she imagined. The board meeting room was larger than the executive conference suite. Circular table, recessed lighting, screens embedded in the walls. The atmosphere was less theatrical here, more surgical. Decisions made in this room didn't echo. They recalibrated. He stood near the head chair, speaking quietly to two board members. When he noticed me, the shift in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. A tightening of the shoulders, a recalculation. "This meeting is for directors only," he said evenly. I set my portfolio on the polished surface. The sound was soft, but it cut through the room. "As a shareholder, I believe I qualify," I replied. One of the independent directors adjusted his glasses. "Shareholder votes aren't on today's agenda." "That depends," I said calmly, sliding a document across the table, "on how you define control." The room grew still. He exhaled through his nose, a sound designed to communicate patience. "Your position has been eliminated. We're restructuring leadership." Yes, I nodded. Leadership. I opened the portfolio. Inside were the updated cap tables reflecting dilution events, conversion triggers, and cumulative grants. Each page tabbed, each percentage highlighted, 85% voting shares resting beside my name in calm, unembellished ink. Paper doesn't shout, it doesn't dramatize, it simply states. One of the directors leaned forward. 85, he murmured. Silence can be louder than outrage, the kind that fills your ears like pressure before a storm. He reached for the documents, scanning quickly at first, then slower. Confidence drains in stages. First comes dismissal, then confusion, then arithmetic. That's not possible, he said quietly. It is, I answered. Fully vested, verified, filed. The corporate counsel, seated at the far end, requested a copy. I handed one over without ceremony. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the glass like restrained applause. Minutes passed. In offices, power often masquerades as charisma. In board meetings, power is math. Counsel cleared his throat. These allocations were approved during prior expansion rounds, he said, voice neutral. Converted incentives, exercised options, dilution impacted minority shareholders disproportionately. The majority holder retained position. The majority holder, a phrase that hung in the air like a suspended verdict. He stared at counsel as if the man had switched languages mid-sentence. Clarify, he demanded. Counsel folded his hands. She is the controlling shareholder. The words did not explode. They landed, clean, irreversible. Around the table, posture shifted. Directors who had moments ago aligned their body language toward him now angled slightly toward me. Not dramatically, just enough to register gravity. Offices are ecosystems. Gravity decides orientation. I did not smile. Victory expressed too loudly can fracture its own elegance. Instead, I spoke evenly. As controlling shareholder, I request a vote of confidence in current executive leadership. The rain slowed, as if even the weather paused to listen. He leaned back, disbelief sharpening into something more dangerous, fear disguised as indignation. You're orchestrating a coup, he said. No, I replied softly. I'm exercising ownership. A murmur circled the table. The directors weren't sentimental. They were pragmatic. Stability, fiduciary duty, shareholder value. Words repeated in every quarterly report. Words that now applied differently. The vote proceeded. Hands raised, one by one. Not impulsively. Not theatrically. Deliberately. He watched each hand as though betrayal had a physical form. When the final tally settled, the outcome was unambiguous. Leadership would transition. Effective immediately. No shouting, no slammed fists. Just a quiet rearrangement of authority. The kind that leaves no broken glass, only a different name on the door. He stood slowly. This isn't over, he said, voice lower now. It's procedural, I answered. Procedure is such a gentle word for irreversible change. As directors gathered their materials, counsel approached me with formal courtesy. We'll need to file amended disclosures by end of day. Of course, I said. Efficiency is comforting after shock. Outside the room, whispers ignited across floors, assistants refreshing internal messaging platforms, analysts rechecking reporting lines. The building sensed tremors before official announcements were drafted. He passed me near the doorway. For the first time since the conference room, he truly looked at me, not as an employee, not as a subordinate, but as consequence. There was no triumph in my chest, only steadiness. A recalibrated equilibrium. Justice without spectacle. And if you think power shifts like this go unnoticed, wait until the official memo circulates. By tomorrow morning, the entire company will understand what 85% really means. Have you ever watched power shift in complete silence? Share your thoughts below and follow to see what happens when ownership rewrites the rules. The official memo went out at 8:42 a.m. Subject line, leadership transition, no exclamation marks, no dramatic language, just calibrated neutrality. By 8:47, the building felt different, not louder, quieter, like the moment after an unexpected storm when everyone steps outside to assess what's still standing. My name appeared 3 times in the announcement, once as controlling shareholder, once as interim executive authority pending board confirmation, and once in a sentence so carefully worded it almost shimmered. The board expresses full confidence in her strategic oversight. Confidence. A week ago, my position had been eliminated. I stood in the same corner office I had been asked to vacate, sunlight spilling across the desk in long golden stripes. The city below moved as if nothing had shifted. Traffic lights blinked, people crossed streets, coffee shops filled. Inside these walls, tectonic plates had rearranged. The glass still carried faint smudges from his framed awards, recently removed. Their absence left pale rectangles on the wall, ghosts of recognition. I traced one lightly with my fingers. Power leaves outlines when it departs. There was a knock. Marta from finance stepped in, clutching a tablet to her chest as though it might shield her. "The markets are stable," she reported. "Investors are asking questions, but nothing volatile." "Good," I said. "Transparency meeting at noon, all departments." Her eyes flickered, curiosity, relief, perhaps admiration. "Yes, of course." When she left, I allowed myself a slow breath. The first test wasn't winning the vote. It was holding the room afterward. At noon, the main auditorium filled with the muted hum of speculation. Employees clustered in cautious groups. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched openly, searching for cues. I stepped onto the stage without introduction. For a heartbeat, the silence felt immense. Then I began. "I know transitions can feel abrupt," I said, "especially when they're unexpected." A ripple passed through the audience. "But ownership comes with responsibility. My responsibility is stability, clarity, and forward movement. No accusations, no dramatics. The truth doesn't require embellishment." Hands folded, I outlined immediate priorities: operational continuity, retention packages for key teams, audit transparency. I mentioned voting shares only once, briefly, factually, enough to anchor legitimacy without waving it like a flag. Every 2 minutes I paused, allowing them to breathe, to adjust, because fear in an organization spreads like ink in water unless you contain it. A hand rose near the front. "What does this mean for layoffs?" a voice asked, straight to the heart. "It means decisions will be based on data, not optics," I replied. "And they will be communicated directly, not implied." A subtle shift moved across the room, shoulders lowering, pens lifting. Trust doesn't roar when it arrives. It exhales. Afterward, department heads approached one by one, some with proposals, some with cautious loyalty, a few with carefully masked regret for prior silence. One of them lingered. "Daniel, operations." "I didn't know," he said quietly. "About the shares?" "I know," I answered. He hesitated. "He assumed—" "Yes," I said. "He assumed." Assumptions are fragile structures. They collapse under documentation. By late afternoon, the office buzz had transformed into something sharper. Momentum, teams recalibrating strategies, assistants updating org charts, legal preparing amended filings. Control was no longer theoretical. Still, power attracts resistance. An email notification blinked across my screen. Anonymous sender, no signature. You think this is over? I read it twice. No threat, just implication. I closed the message without responding. Control isn't about reacting to shadows. It's about reinforcing foundations. At 6:15 p.m., as the building began to empty, counsel stepped into my office. "We've filed the disclosures," he said. "Regulatory acknowledgement pending." "Any irregularities?" I asked. "None." Outside, the sky had shifted into violet and deepening blue. City lights flickered on like quiet applause. He paused at the door. "You handled today with restraint," he observed. "Restraint scales better than revenge," I replied. A faint smile crossed his face before he left. Alone again, I stood by the window. Below, the streets carried thousands of private narratives, none aware of the recalibration above them. In the reflection of the glass, I saw not triumph, but alignment. Titles are borrowed. Ownership is permanent, and somewhere in this building, someone was still calculating their next move. So was I. The resistance did not announce itself with raised voices or dramatic resignations. It arrived as hesitation. Reports that used to land on my desk at 9 a.m. began appearing at 9:17. Meeting confirmations came with subtle delays. A budget approval request was accidentally routed through an outdated chain of command, none of it large enough to challenge directly, all of it deliberate enough to notice. Power rarely fights head-on, it tests the perimeter. By Wednesday, I had a pattern. 3 department heads, operations, procurement, and strategy, had begun holding alignment discussions without looping in legal. Calendar blocks labeled internal sync, no agenda attached, a soft rebellion disguised as productivity. I didn't confront them. Instead, I requested data, a full operational audit, vendor contracts, renewal terms, performance benchmarks tied to incentive structures approved during the previous executive tenure. Clean, factual, unemotional. When numbers move, they leave fingerprints. The audit meeting was scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. Same board meeting room, same circular table, different gravity. They entered with practiced neutrality. Daniel avoided my eyes at first. Procurement's lead carried a leather folder too stiff to be casual. Strategy smiled, a little too brightly. I began without accusation. "I've reviewed vendor renewals from the past 18 months, I said, projecting the summary onto the embedded screen. Several contracts were extended without competitive bidding. Silence. Strategy shifted in her seat. Those renewals were time-sensitive. Yes, I nodded. Time-sensitive to whom? The question settled heavily. On the screen, percentages appeared, margin discrepancies, commission structures tied to consulting advisories. Language that sounded impressive until translated into cost. The atmosphere cooled. "I'm not suggesting misconduct," I continued evenly. "I'm suggesting inefficiency." A softer word, harder to defend against. Procurement cleared his throat. Those relationships were cultivated personally by the former CEO. There it was. Legacy loyalty. "Understood," I said. "However, as controlling shareholder, my fiduciary duty is to shareholder value, not personal alliances." The phrase was precise, not emotional, not vindictive, fiduciary duty. Daniel finally looked up. "What are you proposing?" "A temporary suspension of non-essential renewals, independent review committee, transparent rebid process." Strategy's smile faded. "That will disrupt ongoing projects." "Only those dependent on inflated margins," I replied gently. The room tightened. No one accused me of overreach. They couldn't. The authority was documented, filed, voted. What they hadn't expected was scrutiny without spectacle. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. No raised voices, no theatrical resignations, just incremental dismantling of old scaffolding. When it ended, I remained seated while they gathered their materials. "Change feels personal," I said before they reached the door. "It isn't." "It's structural." Daniel paused. "Was this your plan from the beginning?" he asked quietly. I considered the question. "No," I said. "The plan was stability. Accountability is simply part of it." After they left, I reviewed the vendor breakdown one more time. The numbers aligned too cleanly to be accidental. Incentive kickbacks masked as performance bonuses. Consulting retainers attached to companies owned by distant relatives of senior leadership. Nothing illegal, just convenient. Convenience is expensive when no one checks the math. By afternoon, word had spread that procurement contracts were under review. The building's energy shifted again, less resistance, more caution. When oversight becomes consistent, rebellion becomes inefficient. At 4:30 p.m., legal delivered a preliminary summary of potential cost recovery through renegotiation. The projected savings were significant. I allowed myself the smallest curve of a smile, not because someone would lose, but because the company would stabilize. An email draft sat open on my screen, a communication to investors outlining operational refinement and cost realignment. Transparent, data-backed, calm. Before sending it, I reread one line. Governance is not about authority, it is about accountability. I pressed send. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring once, twice, then answered, his voice. "You're dismantling everything I built," he said, not angrily, wounded. "I'm preserving what was worth building," I replied. A pause, breathing on the other end, calculation. "You think the board will always back you?" "I think documentation outlasts personalities." Silence again. "This won't be simple," he warned. "It never was," I said. When the call ended, I stood by the window once more. The city was brushed in amber light, traffic flowing in steady rivers below. Control had shifted, but consolidation was still underway. And if you believe the audit was the final move, you haven't seen what transparency does when it reaches investors. Monday opened with numbers, not rumors, not tension, numbers. The investor call began at 9 a.m., sharp. Screens across the executive floor flickered to life, graphs poised like instruments before a performance. I stood at the head of the table, not because the seat mattered, but because visibility does. "Thank you for joining," I began, voice steady, measured. Today's update focuses on governance refinements and operational efficiency. No drama, no mention of conflict, just structure. The presentation unfolded with deliberate clarity. Cost realignment projections, vendor review outcomes, adjusted EBITDA forecasts. Each slide was stripped of personality and heavy with data. Transparency, when delivered calmly, feels almost disarming. Questions followed. Were prior leadership incentives aligned with long-term value? One analyst asked. A review identified inconsistencies, I answered. They are being corrected. Another voice chimed in. Is there risk of internal instability? On the contrary, I said. Stability increases when accountability is standardized. A beat of silence. Then the tone shifted. I appreciate the clarity, an investor noted. The market responds well to disciplined governance. Discipline. The word echoed softly. When the call ended, our stock ticker on the side monitor showed a subtle upward movement. Nothing explosive, just steady confidence, the kind that compounds. In the hallway outside the boardroom, conversations were different now. Less whispering, more recalibrating. Resistance thrives in ambiguity. Remove ambiguity, and it loses oxygen. By noon, 3 department heads had submitted revised budget frameworks voluntarily. Procurement proposed renegotiated vendor bids without being prompted. Strategy requested a performance-based incentive redesign aligned with measurable outcomes. Alignment. It's remarkable how quickly posture changes when the ground stabilizes. Mid-afternoon, counsel stepped into my office again. "The regulatory acknowledgement is complete," he said. "No objections, filings accepted." Paper sealed, official, irreversible. I nodded once. He hesitated. "There's one more matter." He handed me a slim envelope, formal letterhead, legal phrasing dense but unmistakable. A voluntary resignation from the former CEO's advisory position, effective immediately. No confrontation, no public dispute, just withdrawal. For a moment, I studied the signature at the bottom, the same hand that had slid the termination folder across the table, the same confidence etched in ink. Control does not disappear loudly. It fades when leverage dissolves. I placed the letter in the top drawer of my desk without ceremony. Later that evening, as the building lights dimmed one by one, I walked through the executive corridor. Doors closed, offices orderly. A different calm now. Earned, not imposed. In the quiet, I remembered the first day I joined the company. No title worth mentioning, no corner office, just a seat near the window and a notebook filled with projections no one asked for. Ownership had not arrived overnight. It accumulated in patience, in decisions to accept shares instead of applause, in questions asked during meetings, when others preferred silence. Back in my office, the skyline shimmered under nightfall. The city never pauses long enough to celebrate victories. It moves, always forward. My phone buzzed with a final notification of the day. Market close, up 3.2%. Not dramatic, decisive. I leaned back in the chair once occupied by someone who believed authority was permanent. Titles evaporate, governance endures. And tomorrow, for the first time in weeks, the building would wake without tension humming in its walls. But peace, like power, must be maintained. Morning arrived without resistance, no delayed reports. No strategic calendar blocks disguised as secrecy. The building felt lighter, not because conflict had vanished, but because clarity had replaced it. Clarity has weight, but it's honest weight. You can stand under it without bending. At 8:30 a.m., I held a brief executive alignment session. No dramatic speeches, just metrics, timelines, and accountability markers. The whiteboard carried clean lines, revenue stabilization targets, audit follow-ups, incentive restructuring deadlines. Performance will be visible, I said. So will progress. There were nods, real ones this time. Daniel spoke first. Procurement bids are coming in 15% lower than prior renewals. Strategy added, "We've redesigned leadership bonuses to vest against 3-year performance indicators. No defensiveness, no hesitation, just adaptation." That's when I understood something essential. People rarely resist change itself. They resist uncertainty. Remove the fog, and even former skeptics begin to move with you. By mid-morning, HR presented retention statistics. Attrition risk had dropped. Employee engagement scores, measured quietly after the leadership transition, showed cautious optimism. Cautious. Trust rebuilds in increments. At noon, I walked through the main floor unannounced. Conversations didn't stop when I passed. Screens remained open. That subtle shift meant more than applause ever could. In the design department, a junior analyst approached me. "I just wanted to say," she began, slightly nervous, "it feels steadier." "Good," I replied. "It should." She smiled, then returned to her desk with renewed focus. Steadiness is contagious. Back upstairs, I finalized the long-term governance charter. Independent oversight committee, mandatory contract review cycles, transparent equity reporting to avoid future imbalance misunderstandings, systems that protect the company even if personalities change, especially if they change. In the late afternoon, I stood once more before the board, this time not in tension, but in structure. We have an opportunity, I said, to institutionalize what happened, not as conflict, but as correction. Council nodded. One director leaned forward thoughtfully. Another simply said, "Proceed." The vote to confirm permanent executive leadership passed without drama. Unanimous. The word carried no fireworks, yet it resonated more deeply than the earlier tally. Not because I had won, but because the company had aligned. As the meeting adjourned, I gathered my papers slowly. No rush, no urgency pressing at the edges anymore. In the hallway, sunlight spilled across the floor in long, deliberate lines. The same building, the same walls, but the energy had transformed from guarded to grounded. My office door closed softly behind me. On the desk lay two objects, the original termination folder and the finalized governance charter. I placed them side by side for a moment. One represented assumption, the other represented documentation. I slid the termination folder into the archive cabinet, not out of spite, not as a trophy, just as a reminder, not of victory, of vigilance. Outside, the city moved in its endless rhythm, cars merging, signals shifting, people chasing private ambitions. Inside, the company moved too, forward, stable, accountable. No dramatic headlines, no public spectacle. Just a quiet restructuring of reality built on paper, patience, and precision. He had believed eliminating my position eliminated my presence. Instead, it clarified my ownership. And that is the quiet power of signing with a smile.